Oh, do you know if there's one thing that really boils my piss, it's all this shit about cultural appropriation. I accept, just let me say right from the off here, while somebody doesn't say, well, there must be worse things going on in the world than cultural appropriation. I accept there are things that I could talk about within this video or any other video where the impact in terms of the world and the peoples of the world is greater than that of those who are whining and crapping on about cultural appropriation. But in almost each and every case, at least when I view it from the perspective of the person who is doing it, I can at least see how it functions from their perspective. What I can't get my head around with cultural appropriation is that it is done from a progressive perspective, and yet it seems about the most detrimental thing you could do from a progressive perspective that I can think of. Now, what I want to talk about in this video is something that I came across as a result of watching an Andy Warski video. I will say right from the off, I'm not a massive fan of Andy Warski videos. I kind of feel if you've watched one of them, you've watched all of them. They tend to be somewhat low on information, low on analysis, and high on hamming it up on the part of Andy and his mate who does his videos with him. But his video did put me on to this little thing, and I just, as soon as I saw it, I thought this is taking something which is a load of bollocks and taking it up a few notches. Let me tell you about this. This was an artist who was going to have her work exhibited in Toronto, Canada. An artist called Amanda PL. Let me show you a link to a news item. So this is a link to the CBC News website, and the headline, Toronto Gallery cancels show after concerns artist bastardizes Indigenous art. Outrage over a Toronto artist borrowing from the style of an acclaimed Indigenous painter has prompted the gallery to cancel its plans for an upcoming exhibit. Visions Gallery had planned to showcase the work of Amanda PL, 29, a local non-Indigenous artist who says she was inspired by the woodland style made famous in the 60s by the Anishinaabe artist Noel who focused on nature, animals, Indigenous spirituality and medicine. But within hours of the gallery's email announcement promoting the exhibit, there was a backlash with people alleging that PL had appropriated Indigenous culture and art. It goes on. Chippewa artist and mind-bogglingly blatant hypocritical cunt, I added that bit, but you'll see why in a minute, Soule was among those leading the charge. He argues PL blatantly copied Morisot with virtually no regard for the storytelling behind his work. What she's doing is essentially cultural genocide. Yes, painting in this guy's style is equivalent to cultural genocide, according to Soule, because she's taken his stories and retelling them, which bastardizes it down the road. How horrific. Other people will see her work and they'll lose the connection between the real stories that are attached to it, said Soule. Okay, PL said she first became inspired by the woodland style when she was living in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Imagine that, being inspired by somebody who's from a different culture to your own. How horrific. Studying to become a visual arts teacher and taking native studies. I just tried to learn all I could about the original culture, their teachings, their stories, and I've tried to capture the beauty of the art style and make it my own by drawing upon elements of nature within Canada that have meaning to me. She was surprised by the reaction when her exhibit was announced, especially online. A lot of the Aboriginal people had issues with me not being native. I feel like they think that I'm taking away their culture, but really I'm not, PL said. I think it's a shame to say that an artist can't create something because they're not from that race. Okay, this is the really interesting bit here. We go down here, McGee, who's the person that operates the gallery, said that his own opinion there is no debate about appropriating from Indigenous people. Yes, it's tricky cultural issues and borrowing from different cultures. Everybody has an opinion. But everyone here in Canada has to be aware of the history of how Indigenous people have been dealt with from the time of colonial settlements, and there is a specific perspective that we have to have with respect to that culture, McGee said. Soule, Soule, good old J. Soule shares that view. This is the most amazing bit. Listen to this shit. His own work flips indigenous stereotypes on their head in everything from sports teams to film, taking well-known movie posters and recasting them with titles like The Bride of Frankenstein and Tribe of Dracula. So let me get this straight, right? This artist who's creating a big brouhaha about this, his stock in trade, his livelihood is based upon taking the artifacts of other people's culture and, in his own words, bastardizing them. What must that say about the way that he views his own culture as something very, very special and precious, and everybody else's culture, if what he's talking about here he regards as a process of bastardization? It just kind of beggars belief that anybody could be so hypocritical and yet have the gall to try and justify it. I have a very different perspective to this. I don't regard this kind of cultural appropriation, if that is what you want to call it, as a bad thing, even to things that are very, very precious to our culture. Now listen, I'm from England, right, and there are some things that the English and the British in a wider scope, the Scottish, Welsh and the Northern Irish as it is now, there are some things that we've done very, very well. In fields such as science, we've been amongst the preeminent nations with some of the most greatest scientists of all times. I suppose the most prominent two will be Charles Darwin and Isaac Newton. But also we had the Industrial Revolution. We had marvellous engineers like Isambard Kingdom Brunel, George Stephenson, James Watt. In these areas we have been preeminent in many ways. But one thing that we've always lacked a little bit, I think, is on some of the more cultural side relative to other countries in the rest of Western Europe. We've never had a Van Gogh or a Da Vinci. We've never had a Beethoven or a Mozart or a Bach. But what we have got is William Shakespeare, right? In a field of drama and poetry and plays, and those spheres, we have possibly the biggest name of the lot. And Shakespeare looms large over especially English culture, both in terms of his body and work, but also the way that he influences modern English culture. Most people do not realise just how many turns of phrase and how many ways that we structure our language stem from things that Shakespeare wrote. And yet, if you look around the world at the way that Shakespeare is treated around the world, well, look, let me give you some examples of it. So here you go for the first example of what J. Soule would regard as the bastardization and cultural genocide of the crowning jewel of the British literary tradition. We have from Tunisia, Macbeth, Layla and Ben, A Bloody History. Tunisian Macbeth, where Shakespeare's malevolent tyrant and his wife are reincarnated as the equally diabolical modern-day duo Layla and Zini Ben Ali. Combining Shakespeare's text with film and reportage, this production interrogates the way Arab leaders use, possess and perpetuate power. Let's go next to Cape Town, South Africa for a production of Venus and Adonis. The unique and much loved Isango Ensemble from Cape Town kick proceedings off with a carnival interpretation of this great narrative poem. They will bring the same modern African sensibility brimming over with song and dance to Shakespeare's great story of seduction and loss of innocence. I'm going to take you next to Soule in South Korea. Okay, to a performance combining music, mime, song and dance of A Midsummer Night's Dream to create an exhilarating adaptation of Shakespeare's inventive and glittering comedy, focusing on the story of four mortal lovers and the spirits of the East Asian forest. Okay, let's have a look where next. Lahore, Pakistan for The Taming of the Shrew, no less. Theatre Walai, KASHF, presents a new production of The Taming of the Shrew, starring the Lahore screen and stage star Nadia Jamil as Catherine. Rich in colour and energy, the production explores the difficulties encountered by modern Pakistani women. I don't recall that being in the original. With live singers and musicians, a thrilling Bangra jig rounds off this uplifting version of the first rom-com. Let's go to Madrid, Spain for Henry VIII. Now, 400 years later, Rakata, Madrid's premier young classical company, reimagined this play, in other words, bastardise and commit cultural genocide to the whole of English culture from a Spanish perspective. What about Othello? This is a good one. Chicago, USA. A fresh urban take upon Shakespeare's tragedy, spun out, smashed up, and lyrically rewritten over original beats. Fuck knows what Soule would think if this was something to do with his culture. The Q brothers are America's leading reinterpreters of Shakespeare through hip-hop. What about this one? Brazil, Romeo and Juliet. Perhaps the America's most famous production of the most famous play ever, Grupo Galpau's carnivalesque Romeo and Juliet, returns to the globe with its thrilling mix of circus, music, dance, and Brazilian folk culture. Yeah, just like the original Romeo and Juliet, brimming over with Brazilian folk culture. Okay, so maybe I overlabored the point there, but I did that for a reason, because is that a negative thing that's taking place with regard to Shakespeare there? Certainly, in the eyes of Soule, that would constitute bastardization and cultural genocide. Surely, is that a bad thing? I would say no. And not because Shakespeare's a fucking white devil and so that you can do what the fuck you like with his stuff because it doesn't fucking matter, but actually for rather more positive reasons than that. Because by reinterpreting Shakespeare in those different ways, it brings his message to a greater number of people, right? So it brings people get to experience some of what Shakespeare had to say that otherwise would find his work inaccessible. That has got to be a positive, whether we're talking about William Shakespeare, surely, or whether we're talking about indigenous Canadian art. And the other thing is that it brings English culture to a global audience. It doesn't make me ashamed. It doesn't make me think, how can they do these terrible things to my culture? But rather it sees people reimagining my culture in terms of their own culture and taking on board part of my culture. And surely this whole process of cultural mixing and blending is something that we're supposed to be celebrating, isn't it? I know my country doesn't have a perfect relationship with India over the centuries due to colonialism, but nevertheless, in many ways, aspects of my culture have impacted on India, which has, of course, the Westminster parliamentary system. Many of its structures are set up in ways because of the influence of my culture on Indian culture. And Indian culture has influenced my culture to such a degree that nowadays, alongside fish and chips, chicken tikka masala is regarded as one of the English national dishes. Is that something that we should hang our heads in shame about? No, that's seen as a cultural positive, that cultures are mixing and taking things from one another. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe Soule does, and I know this is going to sound like I'm sort of implying that maybe he's a little bit racist. I'm not doing that, but maybe he wants his culture kept pure, right? He doesn't want his culture tainted with other people's cultures. Maybe that's what he doesn't like, and his culture should be solely for the preserve of people of his culture and kept absolutely pure and not distilled down in any form. Sure, his business, his livelihood is made doing exactly the same thing to other people's cultures, but that's okay as far as he is concerned. But this is the problem that I have. I said at the beginning of the video that as far as I'm concerned, what really boils my piss about this is that it does exactly the wrong thing, right? It's so self-destructive, and the reason that it's self-destructive is that when you look across all the different forms of media, one of the biggest complaints is how Eurocentric it is, and how white it is, and how especially kind of traditional white Western European cultural stereotypes, and I suppose you could say memes and tropes and scenarios and backgrounds tend to dominate. Think of all the things set in the kind of medieval Middle Ages with knights and castles and all this kind of thing. And there's a lot of criticism that there's not enough cultural diversity. There's not enough ethnic diversity. Why is it all white Western European culture that gets this? Why don't these other cultures get a look in? Why aren't games developers? Why aren't film developers? Why aren't these people taking on board more of other people's culture and giving them a bit of screen time as well? And yet when they do, the problem is then you get twats like Soule turning up and saying, well, that's unacceptable, that's cultural appropriation, you're bastardizing my culture now. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Look, let me lay it on the line here. You either want minority and non-Western cultures treated the same as Western culture, with all the extra exposure and inclusivity into global culture that brings, or you want it to be treated with special reverence, with kid gloves, and only by people who come from that culture. But then you have to accept that it's not going to get very much of a look in. What you can't expect is for both of those things, because Western culture is very rarely treated with very much reverence. It's treated in a very irreverent fashion, and it's picked up and thrown to one side and pulled to pieces and misrepresented in every way, shape or form. You can't expect your things to be treated any different from that if you want them to be set alongside and used in the same context. I mean, the tragedy of this woman's work, this Amanda PL, if you listen to what I read out earlier on, is that she was somebody who was actually treating this work with respect. She had a great reverence for this work, for this indigenous style of art, and she'd studied it and she was interested in it, and she wanted to bring her own influences into reproducing her own version of it. But even that wasn't good enough. I mean, where the fuck do you go from there? I mean, I think you're looking at me like you think I'm maybe going to furnish you with some kind of answer, but I don't think there is an answer to that one, even if this cultural appropriation was a reasonable thing. If we did in some ways own our cultures and the aspects of our culture, which I don't think that we do. I have no right, if somebody does a Shakespeare play that I don't approve of, a reimagining of it, to say you have to stop doing it. That's part of my culture. I get to say what you can do with that. We don't own these things. As soon as they're created, they are things that are owned by the entire world, and people can do with them whatever they like. But even if you are somebody that takes on board this idea of cultural appropriation, you have to see what harm you're doing. To put people in a situation where you say to them, we need to stop centering everything around Western European culture, and yet the only culture you allow them to center things around is Western European culture. And as soon as they try out of all the right motives to bring in something else, you just slam them down for cultural appropriation. That's absolute horseshit. And I really think that people need to think twice about what they're doing if this is something that they're engaging in. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.